you say, original Facebook, as I call it. All the Zen and Buddhist places around. Nice to see you guys. Good to have you here. Our honored uh, guest of guests today is Barbara O'Brien, who's I don't know where she's on your screen and my screen. She's up in the corner there. Hello, Barbara.
Hello.
As many of you know, Barbara has written a book that was long overdue in the Zen world. We had several marvelous efforts at telling Zen history one way or the other. But Barbara has written a book that, in my view, tells it like it is, which somebody needed to do, but also from a practitioner's view. She has worked that nice middle ground between scholarly seriousness and trying to tell things honestly. She tells, sometimes she says, well, this story may not be historical, you know. Some things that we take, she may say this may be more legend than it is an actual historical event, but this is where the practitioner comes in. She then says, but as a practitioner, you know, this story is so precious to us. And here is really the meaning that is still alive for us. And she brings those two aspects together, which is something that someone who's just a historian and scholar could not do, and someone who's just a practitioner could not do. You need the merging of both. And that's why I'm so glad Barbara's here. I'm going to ask her to introduce herself in a second, but I want to say most of you know Barbara from other places. Tricycle Magazine, her many columns on the internet in which she answers questions, and about.com for many years. And if you always wanted to know a good down-to-earth, realistic presentation of our history, Barbara O'Brien was the place to go for that. So Barbara, I want to thank you for many years of being the place I went when I needed information. And I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Barbara.
Well, thank you, Jindo, for your kind words about my work and about Circle of the Way. And I'm really pleased to be here.
Now, the book has been out for a few months now.
Right. It came out in November.
And you just briefly mentioned, you tell us about some of your other writing that you've done over the years.
Well, primarily I wrote for about.com from 2008 to 2016 when they scuttled the whole site and turned it into something else. A lot of my old work is still on the web, but I haven't written for them since 2016. And I've also written about Buddhism. I've written some things, as you say, for Tricycle, for Lion's Roar. The Guardian website a while back published some of my things on Buddhism. And so, and I just am something of a loudmouth on the web generally. So, hey.
And I know your talk today will be about the importance of history and history even for practitioners. But can I ask you just quickly, how did you develop your personal interest in history?
Well, I'm a history nerd. I actually wasn't all that interested in history when I was in school, unfortunately. But after I got out of finished college, my first job was as a copy editor for a university press. And so I ended up copy editing a lot of history books, and I got interested in history. So now I'm a terrible history nerd and also a Zen practitioner. So that seems to go together for me.
Well, I got a feeling that most of the people here we're all nerds in our way too, right?
Yes.
Most of the people in Zen are, right? Fellow nerds, everybody raise your hands.
Yay.
Yay, okay. We're going to sit for about 25 minutes. So what we usually recommend is just find a wall or turn towards the floor nearest to you, and just take a comfortable position. And I'm going to ring the bell, and we'll sit. All right, Barbara?
Okay.
Very good. All right, lovely. I'll just say uh, briefly that if we have any latecomers who are watching at home, feel free to just jump on in. Uh, you're welcome to join us. And later we'll have a question and answer session. I've sent my email address to several people, or we'll be taking personal messages to my account at Treeleaf, and we'll get to as many of those as we can later. But right now, without further ado, Barbara, it's
Yes.
all yours.
Okay. Well, good morning or afternoon or whatever to everybody. I want to speak today about why it's important for Zen students to know something about Zen history. My first Zen teacher, the late John Daido Loori, used to say that we all live in a box, and the dimensions of the box are made up of who we think we are and what we think our life is supposed to be. And of course, the function of psychotherapy and of most popular self-improvement programs is to redecorate the box. You put in better furniture and maybe expand it, put in windows, bring some light in. That's very nice. But the purpose of Zen is to realize that really there is no box. And the way you do that is by looking very closely at what the box is made of to see the ephemeral nature of it. Stories are a big part of boxes. As we live our lives, we tend to craft a personal narrative of who we think we are and what we think life is supposed to be. That's all about me. And the dramatic tension of the story, of course, is created by all the ways that life frustrates us, doesn't give us what we want or what we expect. And deep down, most of us cling to a hope that someday all the plot lines will come together and we will live happily ever after. So maintaining this personal ongoing story in which we are the star is one of the ways we create the illusion of a continuing, permanent, autonomous self. And it's how we craft our identity. The Buddha understood this and taught people how to break the connection to that personal story with mindfulness by paying moment to moment attention to just what is without intellectual filters, without judgments, without putting our experience in any kind of context. We can begin to realize that the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves aren't reality. And the person starring in our story isn't really who we are. A few years ago, the Zen teacher Norman Fisher published a book called Sailing Home that is about exploring our personal stories. He wrote that when we stop getting lost in our own plot lines with our tensions and expectations, we begin to see the feedback loops and the old tapes we keep replaying that keep us stuck in suffering and confusion. And in the book, Norman Fisher suggested an exercise in which we begin by remembering taking our earliest memory, and then taking 2 or 3 memories from childhood and 2 or 3 from adolescence and 2 and 3 from young adulthood and so on. And then crafting a story, a narration, not a resume, but just a story that pulls all those memories together. And then after you've done that, you go back and you pick a different set of memories, entirely different set, and make a story about that. And what you may find is that you've told 2 very different stories about 2 entirely different people, which might put the question of who do you think you are in a new light. However, I think it has to be said that none of us probably can ever completely stop creating a personal narrative because humans are wired to do that. And we just need to make sure our story is honest and that it provides a healthy foundation for practice and for being a functional human being. And perhaps we shouldn't take the story too seriously. Now, history might be defined as the creation of an ongoing narrative in a collective sense. I suspect historians would hate that definition, but let's go with it for now. In ancient times, most of what we call history, of course, was a lot of myth and folktale, some of which might have been based on events that really happened and possibly not many of them. These narratives were critical to creating the identities of tribes or clans or other groups or nations, so that people knew who they were in a collective sense as members of this group. Sometimes histories had to be revised when there was a change in the group, such as a new dynasty conquering an old one. And then, of course, we had to change the old stories and we have to smash the old images of the old dynasty and put up new ones. So in the modern era, scholars took hold of history and insisted it be only about things that actually happened. And that's an ideal thing, but it's so far they haven't actually lived up to that. It is a fact that history is revised all the time as new generations of scholars and bring their own sensibilities and experiences to it. So if we go back to our exercise about creating different stories based on our own memories, you can apply that to how historians interpret history. Consciously or unconsciously, they shape our views about how we understand the past. So you can take this set of facts and interpret them this way to tell this story, or you can take that set of facts to interpret them that way to tell that story. And the two stories may both be factual and entirely contradict each other. And why does that matter? The past is past, right? Well, if you don't get the past right, sometimes you don't get the present right. Right now in the United States, we're having a terrible struggle over relatively recent history. Our American Civil War ended in 1865, not in 437 BC. And there are vast archives that document everything that happened. So there shouldn't be any question about that. And yet we can't agree on how that history is told, and it's having an impact, a big impact on our present right now. And in spite of all the memes on social media that complain about people living in the past, the truth is that this history is part of the meta box that all Americans live in. It's part of what we think we are and how we think the country is supposed to be. So much of the standard history of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow, and the way that history was taught in American schools for more than a century was crafted by Southern historians and scholars who were apologists for the Confederacy. And these apologists did a bang-up job indoctrinating generations of American school children into a whitewashed and highly romanticized perspective on that part of our history. In other words, thanks in part to the way this part of the story is told, we have avoided confronting and atoning for slavery all these years. We have a whole lot of working through to do that we've never done. The facts of this history cannot be disputed. The people who pushed the South into secession were very open in their letters, speeches, and official documents that their primary objective was to maintain a white supremacist culture and the institution of slavery, and that's what they were all about. There is copious documentation for this. Yet that plain fact is not taught in schools, or wasn't taught when I was in school, and I don't think it's being taught now. So in much of American popular culture, which is the place where we tell our stories about who we think we are and what we think America should be, the Confederacy was about dashing and noble gentleman warriors fighting for some fuzzy idea of states' rights or even liberty, and not about wealthy slave owners desperate to hang on to their wealth and maintain their status as lords of a system that was worse than feudalism. Now, newer generations of academic historians are working to this day to correct the record and counter the pro-Confederate romanticism that's still in our textbooks and American popular culture. To tell a more honest story about slavery and its legacy. And I really do believe that this has to be done before the nation can finally move on and live up to its own ideals of justice and equality. Until we can tell that part of our story correctly, we're not going to get the past and future right either. I mean, the future and the present. Okay, so Buddhist history also has been subject to considerable revision and myth-making. There's very little of the first 5 centuries of Buddhist history that we know of with any certainty. What records we have are fragmentary and conflicting, and they were compiled after the fact by different groups of people who had their own points of view and their own axes to grind. And these records may contain some clues, but they can't be accepted as face value as history. So in recent years, early Buddhist history has become something of a blank slate in which people in the West especially have painted their own views about what they want it to be. And for many of them, what they want it to be is more European. Currently, some Western philosophy professors and some authors of popular Buddhist books are working very hard to pull the historical Buddha out of India and put him in somewhere else, closer to Europe, especially Greece. Now, there really is a reason, as I wrote in Circle of the Way, to believe that there was a lot of cross-pollination between Greek and Buddhist civilizations for a time. As I wrote in the first chapter, beginning about the 2nd century BCE and through the first few centuries of the first millennium, a large part of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan was a center of Buddhist civilization, primarily Mahayana. And this same area was a crossroads of civilization in which Greek, Roman, Persian, Indian, and maybe Chinese cultures intermingled. And this is important to Zen because we know that most of the monastics who brought Buddhism into China came from this area and followed merchants on the Silk Road into China. So if people see some influence of Greek thought in Mahayana Buddhism, and if there is any, it's a good guess that's where it happened. However, some influence isn't good enough for some people. In recent years, I've seen people who speak with authoritative voices declare that the historical Buddha probably wasn't influenced by the religions and philosophies of India at all. And let me say, without going into a lot of detail, that position is utterly unsupportable. And I ran into someone recently who was very sure that Mahayana doctrine of emptiness appeared suddenly in Buddhism from Greek texts smuggled into monasteries and did not evolve naturally and organically from the historical Buddhist teachings, as it certainly seems to have evolved. And so apparently Asians needed Greeks to explain it to them. And I'm only going to say that one should be enormously skeptical of attempts to make the Buddha and early Buddhism more European and less Asian, even when the person making these claims teaches in a university and has a ton of PhDs. I am not saying these people are consciously racist, but I honestly do believe that their ethnocentric biases are causing them to project things onto history that aren't there. Historians are human beings, and unfortunately, there's nothing in the discipline of history that's equivalent to the scientific method that helps weed out biases. All right, so now we have Buddhism introduced to China in the 1st century or so CE. And now I'm going to be challenged to pronounce Chinese names. Let me warn you, I spell better than I pronounce, but I'll do my best. So China was the great petri dish for Mahayana Buddhism that cultured much extraordinary scholarship and a rich diversity of schools, including Huayan, Pure Land, and Tiantai, as well as Zen, which of course in China was called Chan. In the first few centuries of Buddhism in China, there seems not to have been a rigid differences among the schools. All Buddhist monastics received the same ordination. One was not a Tiantai nun or a Huayan nun, but just a Buddhist nun. And the monastics went from one temple to another, often seeking Dharma, and they didn't stick to teachers of just one tradition. But that said, in time, sectarian rivalries formed, and self-preservation demanded that a tradition not only have a highly regarded teachers, but also a respectable backstory. If your school didn't have a respectable backstory, one needed to be invented for other Chinese to take it seriously. So most of the stories we've all heard about the 6 patriarchs and early Chinese masters came from records compiled in the Song Dynasty, which lasted from 960 to 1279. And these are the stories in the classic lamplight records and the Cohen collections that are Zen's shared history. As I explained in Circle of the Way, however, many of these stories aren't so much history as myth, and you might call some of them fan fiction. So one of the things I tried to do in the book was chart a course between the traditional stories and current academic scholarship into Zen history. Most of the time, these two things don't line up very well. Frankly, most of the stories of early Zen that we've heard from teachers is post hoc invention to create a respectable backstory. This includes everything we've ever heard about Bodhidharma. It also includes, unfortunately, the first 1,000 years or so of the transmission lineage, which appears to have been invented about the year 690. Knowing this, what do we do with the tradition of lineage? Well, keep it. The charts are probably accurate for the past several centuries, mostly, which is worthy of respect. The tradition of transmission is well established and is the principal container that has enabled Zen to be passed from generation to generation for a very long time, and I see no reason to change that. And here's another example. There's no more story more central to Zen's identity than that of the sixth patriarch, Huineng. And for that, we can thank the Platform Sutra, which is a wonderful text written in Huineng's voice that expresses much wisdom. However, the academic scholars insist that the original Platform Sutra, which got longer through the centuries, was written about 70 years after Huineng died, and probably not by someone who knew him. Some of the stories in the Platform Sutra about Huineng's life couldn't have happened, the scholars say. For example, the famous poetry contest that secured Huineng as the sixth patriarch couldn't have happened because Huineng and senior student Shenzhou did not study in the fifth patriarch's temple at the same time. But the platform, in many ways, became the glue that held the Zen tradition together through the upheavals of the late Tang Dynasty, in which a lot of other Buddhist traditions perished. The platform's teachings, whoever composed them, were embraced. The literary figure of Huineng, which may or may not have anything to do with the real Huineng, became the prototype of a Zen teacher for a very long time. It elevated the Diamond Sutra and the Prajnaparamita Sutras generally as the scriptures most central to Zen, which they are to this day. So while the Platform Sutra should not be read as history, the platform itself played a critical role in Zen history. And what do we do with it now? We read it, we study it, we absorb it, as many generations of Zen students have done. The Koan literature is rich and useful, but it isn't history. Some of these bits of dialogue and anecdote may be based on events that happened in the past, and some might be outright inventions. And if you want to put them in the category of myth, that's okay with me. But to call something myth is not to say it isn't true, just that it isn't factual. Truth and factuality are not the same thing exactly. We've already seen that it's possible to string selected facts together to tell a false story. By the same token, myths can express something that is deeply true, but not easy to talk about. I like something the religion scholar Karen Armstrong said about myth in an NPR interview several years ago. She said, "Myth is about the unknown. It is about that for which initially we have no words. Myth, therefore, looks into the heart of a great silence." She also said that a myth is something that in some sense may have happened once, but which also happens all the time. So, for example, when we hear the story of the second patriarch who stood outside Bodhidharma's temple or Bodhidharma's cave in the snow and finally cut off his own arm to get Bodhidharma's attention and then proceeded to have a sensible conversation with his arm cut off and bleeding, we might suspect that didn't really happen. But if you think that this story is about two guys who lived in the 6th century, you're missing the point. The story is about you. It's about everyone who first walks into a Zen center or a temple to seek the Dharma. And you're full of questions and confusions, and you might not even know that it's the Dharma you're seeking, just that you're missing something, or you think you are. And maybe you're standing outside and the snow moment will come later in your practice. We may not literally have to cut off our arm and stand in the snow, but metaphorically, maybe we do in some way. But it's up to you to work out how the myth relates to you. It's up to you to clarify what you're doing in Zen and whether the thing you think you're doing is really what you're doing, or if you were ever really missing anything. And then Bodhidharma will say, I have put your mind at rest. So we can appreciate myths as myths and history as history, as long as we don't mix them up. When we do mix them up, it can have unfortunate consequences. For example, one of the points I make in the book is that the fabled connection between Zen and samurai warrior martial arts is way overblown. There's a little bit of connection. Excuse me, I'm being heckled by a cat. Yeah, there she is. But not that really that much. It's more myth than history. But it's a myth that has been robustly romanticized and widely believed. Now, why does it matter? I believe this was a factor, not the only factor, in the way Zen institutions supported Japan's military aggressions of the 20th century. And I believe for a time that this myth also impacted how Western Zen identified itself. For example, my first few sessions back in the 1980s struck me as being more like Marine boot camp than anything else. The atmosphere was very martial and very macho. And I understand that this sort of macho atmosphere permeated many Western Zen centers at the time. From what I've seen, this is less true now, possibly because samurai warrior macho Zen culture smacked into Western feminism, which is just as well. So let's talk about the history as history. Something I realized while I was writing Circle of the Way is that Zen doesn't really have a starting point. In the traditional stories, Zen is said to have been founded in China by Bodhidharma at the beginning of the 6th century, give or take. But in truth, all of the elements of teaching and practice that we associate with early Zen got to China before Bodhidharma did. And Zen didn't really become a distinctive school of Chinese Buddhism until sometime after Bodhidharma was long gone. It appears the school wasn't known collectively as Chan Buddhism until about the 10th century or so. The Zen that China gave the world was, for the most part, Song Dynasty Zen. And the Song Dynasty began more than 4 centuries after we believe Bodhidharma got to China. One of the academic historians I used as a source argues that Zen didn't really become Zen until the Song Dynasty. This scholar, whose name was Morton Schluter, even wrote a book on Song Dynasty Zen that is titled How Zen Became Zen. And it's actually not too bad. I learned a lot from it. But some might ask, if Zen wasn't Zen until then, what was it before that? When did Zen begin? And this reminds me a bit of the story of King Milinda's chariot. If you take it apart, at what point does the collection of parts stop being a chariot? And of course, from the perspective of Buddhism, that's the wrong question, since chariot is just an expedient designation for something that exists only in a relative sense. So like all phenomena, Zen is something composed of many parts without self-essence that came about because of ever-changing causes and conditions, and we identify it with a particular name because we have to call it something to talk about it. And I argue that to fully appreciate what Zen is, one should know something about how it came together to be what it is now, which is what my book Circle of the Way is about. I came to realize that the way the story of Zen traditionally is told, with its emphasis on 6 patriarchs, is not terribly functional. This whole emphasis on a patriarchal lineage, of course, obscures the presence and contributions of women. But beyond that, I'm not sure the patriarchs are all that important. You really see Zen taking shape in the early Tang dynasty, which began in 618 through the work of teachers who were not patriarchs. And I'm thinking, excuse me, in particular of Matsu Daoyi, who gave us ordinary mind is the way, and Shetu Zikian, who gave us the Sandokai, the identity of relative and absolute. And we should also thank the true author of the original Platform Sutra, even if we don't know who that was. And I don't have a problem calling these early masters Zen masters, even if they didn't call themselves that. But even before that, many of the contributions of the very early Oxhead School, which was founded roughly a century before Matsu began teaching, are still deeply embedded in Zen today. And this deserves to be remembered. On the other hand, the third patriarch was probably a name pulled out of a hat to serve as a patch between number 2 and number 4. And after the Tang dynasty and a messy interim period came the Song dynasty. And during the Song dynasty, the many loosely aligned lineages that claimed Huining as a common ancestor became recognized as a distinctive tradition called Chan. And frankly, what pulled it together was not just teaching and practice developed by the Tang masters, but also a boatload of shared myth that had been adopted as history and gave the widely dispersed teachers and students a shared identity. So that was important. During the Song dynasty, the bits of stories called koans were preserved in the classic collections, beginning with the Blue Cliff record in 1125. And koan contemplation was invented in the 12th century and widely embraced, although the Caodong lineages maintained a meditation practice based on earlier forms. Dogen studied with a Caodong teacher in Song China and brought that tradition to Japan in the 13th century, calling it Soto Zen. And soon other monastics brought the koan contemplating practice to Japan and founded Rinzai Zen. And although Zen got to Korea earlier, there was enough cross-pollination between Korean and Chinese Zen during the Song dynasty that it can be said that the Zen of Korea evolved from Song dynasty Zen. Zen got to Vietnam earlier too, but Vietnamese Zen today mostly evolved from the teachings of Chinese Linji masters who escaped the fall of the Ming dynasty in the 17th century. So if Vietnamese Zen sometimes seems to have a different flavor from Japanese and Korean, that's probably why. This history is the basic foundation of Zen as it exists today, including Zen in the West. But Zen in the West, I think, is in a precarious place. It seems to be evolving in 20 directions at once. Sokian Sasaki said that bringing Zen to the West was like holding a lotus to a rock, waiting for it to take root. And he believed that establishing Zen in the West would take several centuries. And he has yet to be proved wrong. Since the Beat Zen era of the 50s, Zen has been in danger of being completely swamped by Western popular culture, which may have embraced Zen as being cool, but also wants it to be something else from what it is and what it ever has been. And in some ways, it's gotten worse since the web was invented. There's all manner of people who clearly have little personal experience with a teacher and don't know which end of the incense stick to light, have set themselves up as experts on the web and spew their own opinions about Zen. And it's hard for traditional Zen to compete with play pretend Zen, frankly. The Zen teacher James Ford wrote recently that such people tend to contribute to a dumbing down of Western understanding of what Zen is. Bottom line, there's a lot of noise and a lot less signal, as some people might say, out on the interwebs. At the same time, people who are sincerely practicing in the Zen tradition face many challenges about how to make it work. In Asia, although there have always been lay students, since at least the early Tang dynasty, it has always been primarily a monastic tradition, yet most of us in the West are lay students with jobs and families and overstuffed schedules. The old Asian model in which monastics did the practice and lay people gave them alms to support them just doesn't really work here. As I wrote in Circle of the Way, there's a lot of experimenting going on right now to figure out how to make teaching and practice more accessible to lay students, and I wish us all a lot of luck. But at this very fluid and precarious moment in Zen history, I strongly suggest that Zen take ownership of its history, by which I mean the history and not just the traditional stories. I spent the large part of 3 years immersed in academic studies of Zen history. And I know the contemporary scholarship fairly well. And let me say, the academics, with very few exceptions, are making a mess of it. They get the facts and dates right, I assume, but often their conclusions and interpretations, especially about practice, are ridiculous. I have compared them to tone-deaf people who write histories of opera, and some of them obviously hate opera and don't know why anyone listens to it. My editor at Shambhala told me that he had once hoped to pursue an advanced degree in Buddhist studies, but he gave up the idea because one of his professors for his undergrad honors thesis, which concerned modern Zen history, was openly antagonistic to Zen. Perhaps that was just one teacher, but I've seen the same antagonism in much of the current scholarship. There's a wonderfully snarky critique of academic scholarship on Zen that was written by Victor Sogen Hori, whom you might recognize as a Zen scholar who has published some wonderful work on koans. Sogen, a Canadian, spent 13 years studying as a monk in Japan and also has a PhD in philosophy from Stanford University, so he's someone with a foot in both worlds. Anyway, he wrote an introduction to volume 2 of Heinrich Dumoulin's Zen Buddhism: A History, and an edition published in 2006 by World Wisdom, and it's worth looking up and reading. He calls out prominent and still influential scholars who portray Zen as a bad joke and nothing but a game of deception. And I cite some of these same scholars in my book because they are the mainstream of academic study, but I concur with Sogen's opinion. It would be great if we could open a respectful dialogue between Zen practitioners and academic scholars, and I would encourage anyone to give it a try, but the attempts I've seen so far have not gone well. The current crop of academics too often assume that they must discount our opinions of our own tradition because obviously we cannot be objective, but they are blind to their own biases. And for that reason, the academic scholars must not be entrusted as the sole guardians of Zen history. And this is important to us because we need a respectful but honest accounting of history to keep us grounded as we go forward. The history is embedded in Zen teachings, whether we know it or not. It is reflected in the liturgy, in the robes, in the rituals, in Zazen itself. Some of the old myths and folk tales may not transfer well to the West, or they might, we'll see. But the history is what it is. And it's a wonderful history. It's a great history, for the most part. And the parts that are less than wonderful need to be acknowledged and understood too. We can learn from them. My teacher, the late Jian Susan Postal, used to talk about what she called the 3 infinities. I believe this formula was original with Susan. These are infinite kindness to the past, infinite service to the present, infinite responsibility to the future. These 3 infinities cannot be separated. We might think that only the present exists, but really it's all here. And by taking good care of the present, we take care of the past and future as well. And that's important. By understanding and appreciating Zen history, our history, we can better understand ourselves as Zen students and teachers. And by better understanding our history, we can do a better job of taking care of this incredible legacy we've been given by our Dharma ancestors. And thank you.
Well, that was so very refreshing and wise. I thank you, Barbara. Is anybody present here? Just get to as many people as possible. And I hope you can all hear me. Yes, give me a wave. Yeah, okay. And folks at home, drop me a PM or an email, and I'll try to get to as many people watching one way. Who's got a question? Koku.
Hi, Barbara. I just want to say, first of all, well, thank you for your talk, but thank you for your book as well. After trawling through 2 volumes of Dumoulin, which is great as far as it goes, but you have to supplement it with so much contemporary scholarship. It's so good to have something we can turn to now. My question is, though, I used to be an academic, and I guess, when I want to know about Zen's history, I've turned to these academic texts and papers and stuff. And now you're saying that probably a lot of it isn't to be trusted. How are we? Okay, not necessarily not to be trusted, but to put maybe a different slant on it than we might see.
Right.
And for those of us who aren't, we read as much as we can, a lot of us, but how can we, I guess, how can we assess a lot of these texts? Because I generally take, if it's written by an academic, I generally give it the benefit of a doubt that they're going to know what they're talking about. So, if there's obvious bits that don't chime as a practitioner, then you get that. But most of the time, I just think this guy or woman probably knows what they're talking about. So how can we judge?
Well, I think that's really difficult. That's one of the reasons why there are big chunks of the history that in the academics and the teachers are like in two different worlds. And for example, if we go back to the Plant Form Sutra and the story of the poetry contest, and the academics, of course, take it apart as a historical document, but they don't understand any of the text the same way that the teachers do. And they don't understand I don't think there's a clear understanding of exactly what the issue was in that part of Zen history when Shanhui, Huineng's student, kind of blew up the Zen world with his claims of that nobody was teaching it right, and Bodhidharma was, and not Bodhidharma, but Huineng was the real sixth patriarch and all that. And I would really like some teachers to go back and take a really hard look at that part of the history, at the original documents, the source material, which I didn't have complete access to because I'm not an academic and I don't have subscriptions to all the places on the web where those things might be. But really go back and take a hard look and say, okay, well, this is what they were really talking about. And because I'm not entirely sure what they were all talking about, and the historians have their own ideas about what it meant, and I don't think any of them understand it. And so I really liked some clarification from the teacher side of it. But I'm saying I think they get the facts right. And in some cases, they do have some insights that I think that Zen practitioners tend to blow over. For example, a point in early Zen where we had two dueling foundational myths. We believe that Zen began because Bodhidharma brought the Lankavatara Sutra to China, which he didn't actually. And also we believe that this is a transmission outside words and letters. So that's two kind of different stories. And the academics will point that out and the Zen people probably don't. So that's one kind of thing that sometimes we need to pay attention to. But for the most part, although the basic facts, I think that they come up with, I think are probably accurate. I assume they are. But just the way they interpret things is just off the charts sometimes. And you have to be, and some of them are openly antagonistic. Some of them you just can tell they think this is all ridiculous stuff and they don't think they want to have anything to do with it. So it's just a matter of using our critical thinking skills keeping our filters up for anything and not accepting anything at face value just because some historian with a PhD says it, or a philosophy professor or somebody says that this is what he thinks. So that's my best answer.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Wave your hands. Hensho.
Thank you, Barbara, for being with us. I'm so really moved by what you're saying, and there are so many levels to it. I also am a former academic, and I'm working with a Buddhist scholar now who is looking at the Jatakas from the Pali. And maybe what I have to say is less of a question, is more of a conundrum. I just like to state that I see happening with her is her, and it's not to be critical of her specifically, it's more of the problem. I think she finds it very hard to confront the Jatakas as they were written in to the community that they were written for. In other words, it's very hard for her to remove a feminist lens or a current day lens, and see those stories for what they were. And I like she's constantly struggling against the lens that she has today as a feminist scholar or a contemporary scholar. And so on the one hand, I feel for academics who are sort of, I mean, we all struggle with that, right? Because we all have a lens that we cannot shed because we've been born in this time. I somewhere in here is a question I have. I think you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. This is a problem with a lot of Buddhist literature and being read in the West, because any good Buddhist teacher, of course, is speaking to the audience in front of her or him,
right?
And is not speaking to the ages. You teach to who you're teaching to, who's in front of you,
right?
And I think there's a lot of, and this is another thing that I think perhaps we need more guidance on. There's a lot of the old literature that was written for, say, 9th century Chinese men who grew up in that culture, that if you take those same words and put them in the West, mean something else entirely. So where you had people such as Linji, for example, was all about getting people to break out of their shells. As the true man of no rank, he has got to stop being such a little toady of Confucian China, but be your own person here and be so that the real you comes out. And he said a lot of shocking things, possibly, although some of that was probably composed in the Song Dynasty, but that's another story. But he was all about, getting people to stop being parts of their culture, this very hierarchical, very old traditional culture, and bringing some newness to it. Well, you take some of that same stuff and put it in the West, where we're all sort of hyper individualistic, and nobody wants to conform to anything, and we like to pretend we're not conformist, even if we're all being nonconformist the same way. And it can be kind of a disaster, It's not really, I think that if Linji himself were put in front of a bunch of 21st century Western Zen students, he would probably tell them to quit acting up and just get down to work to do the practice. So I think you have to do that with a lot of the Buddhist teachings, is remember who this teacher was speaking to, what audience. And of course, there was throughout Buddhist literature, there is a whole lot of stuff that was extremely patriarchal. And we just need to acknowledge that and say, yeah, that's the culture they lived in, but we don't have to put up with that now. That's okay. So yes, it's definitely an issue with West, trying to move Buddhism into the West.
Anyone else? All right, I have one question from Lisa at home, and she said there are I'm just going to paraphrase. There are so many different flavors or lineages of Zen in the West, which ones are the closest to faithful to Asia? And I'm going to add to that a question. What do you think we're getting right in the West that wasn't necessarily from our Asian traditions, but is a kind of a Western invention? But what do you think we're actually added to Zen that's a good thing?
Okay. Well, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is good old Western feminism is really shaking things up. I think that and in fact, all of our liberations here, that we have we're letting people from a lot of different backgrounds in practice together, all sorts of people. And especially now that we have more and more women teachers, my heart teacher, I call her that, Susan Postal, of course, and her teacher was a woman. It's a very matrilineal kind of lineage. I think brings a very different flavor to Zen. Then it's very not macho samurai warrior stuff, very much not. That to me is just so much more healing and just reverberates better with me than maybe the traditional practice ever did. As far as which lineage is closer to Asian, I don't know. I don't even want to address that because I unfortunately have never traveled to Asia. I am so Western myself. A Latino friend once said I'm more gringa than a hot dog. So I think that it's not something that I can really know. So I don't have an answer to that one. But, as far as the whole thing with balancing individuality with conformity is something that I think has always been an issue with Zen. We want to be individual and spontaneous and not feel that we have the whole weight of culture coming down on us in everything we do. But at the same time, just individuality without the parameters of practice and tradition is kind of nothing. So you need both of that. It has to be a balance. So that's my answer.
Who next has a question? You have to be careful. I'm going to mistake someone's gasho for a question and call on somebody. Who's next? Sakishi.
Well, thank you, Barbara. This has been very interesting. It's really aligned with some reading and study that I've been doing lately. One of the things that you said that you referenced a little while ago about some of the teaching, the historical teachings and presentation, I guess in particular, as it being sort of a upaya, that it was addressing people at that time that had a concern at that time that's maybe very distant from us. And in my sort of, I don't know, reading of Zen history and stuff, like one of the stories that I came across from the Soto tradition that really deeply troubled and challenged me was the sort of period in which women were seen as consigned to these blood pool hells, right, for the sin of menstruation. And it was just unbelievably disturbing and awful to me that was part of our tradition. And one of the things that I sort of saw as of course, being an awful thing, I had to chase it and try to understand it at its full picture. But it seems to me that part of that was probably a cultural, historical thing that was going on. And so by offering women a way out of ending up in a blood pool hell, that was a way to help people. to save them from this sort of belief, this sort of myth. And I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what my question is, except that this is clearly something that you've explored. And when you come across stories like that as a practitioner, how do you figure out how to sort of say, this is who I am today, a Western feminist coming across a story like that? How do you sort of square that into practice? Because, some of it is upsetting. I don't know how else to put it. So.
Well, yeah. Well, we have to always remember that Buddhism emerged from extremely patriarchal cultures. And you really can't separate any of it from the culture in which it grew. I mean, that the people who came into Buddhism were creatures of that culture. And as I say at one point late in the book, that I think that cultural conditioning is probably the hardest barrier to get past. We can kind of often resolve our own personal issues and realize that how much of it is illusion, but it's harder to break out of that cultural conditioning. It's really hard to see past that. If you've been taught your whole life that this is the way the world is supposed to be, it just seems to be a terrible thing that even some very advanced teachers have never gotten past. And you just have to recognize that, I mean, our own culture is still patriarchal enough, perhaps not quite that patriarchal, but patriarchal enough that any of us who are women, and I, came of age in the 50s and 60s. And so I'm, when women were supposed to be seen and not heard practically, that you recognize that this is just this big cultural barrier that you have to deal with. And everyone's always had to deal with these things, even in Zen, and it's a shame and it's held back a lot of people, but we don't have to do it. We can say, no, we don't have to do that now. And I don't really have a conflict with that at all. I can just say, well, now I have to say that there are some awesome women in Zen history. When I read about some of the things that some of the women have done who were in Tang and Song China, and so fierce and so strong, even though they came from that, especially Song China was very patriarchal. That's when they were really into foot binding and selling their daughters and all that stuff. And when I read about what some of the women did, it just knocks me out, how strong they were and how determined and fierce. And I go, wow, I'd love to have some of that fierceness and try to live up to that. So we can take that out of the history also. It's really an amazing thing.
Right, we have a little time left. And anyone? Nicholas in Cyprus, anyone? No? All right, I'll ask a quick one that came up in our Sangha today. Someone cited your book, and I think it's not as big an issue as it used to be. But so you've studied the differences between the Soto tradition, the Rinzai tradition as it developed through China and Japan, and then it came west. Do we make too much of the differences? Are there real differences between the two? What is your assessment?
Oh, I think maybe sometimes we make too much of the differences. And especially in my case, I grew up in one of those schools that was a little of both, Daido Lori. It was a Soto temple officially, but he did do koan study. So we were both of that in my first temple. And then I worked with Susan, was a purely Soto teacher who was transmitted from the Shunryu Suzuki lineage. So, I don't have an issue with either one. I think that whatever resonates with you is what I say. If you feel it drawn to do koan study, then do koan study. And if I feel that shikantaza really is better for me, and that's okay. I do sometimes run into people who do have some issues with the other school. You occasionally run into characters who have decided that, well, my school, it's usually Rinzai people, I think, too. My school is the real Zen, and those other people, those Soto people, that's not real Zen. And of course, if you know the story, the history, that's nonsense. And it's also the case that Rinzai people don't realize that the Soto actually, the koan tradition is really part of Soto tradition also. It's not something that only belongs to Rinzai. Soto teachers developed those collections, and Kaodong teachers in China compiled those collections and taught them. And so that's part of a Soto legacy also. So I personally think that we probably make too much of the difference, but some respectful dialogue maybe is a good thing right about now in there. But I think it's good to have both approaches to the Dharma here in the West.
Okay, last chance. Who's got that burning question that they really would like to ask Barbara? Now's your chance. Well, in that case, yes, good. Live from Belgium. Hallo en Kone.
So I'll start by saying that I am a sociologist by training. So while I was a sociologist of religion, so while I was reading your book, the thing that came to me was that what you're describing is very much what happens in any sort of religion. We could think of the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church has its own way of describing its history. And of course, we need scholars from outside that tradition to say that the way they want to describe it is not the way it is. Isn't what you're describing very similar to that, except that as institutions, because Zen institutions are so young, we don't really have the resources and frankly, the scholars and the firepower to contradict the scholars. So in a way, what you're describing, and I realize this is very much about power, but that's what sociologists do. What you're describing is a situation where we don't have the power. And until now, we've ignored what the scholars have said. So we were on very thin ground. And I want to thank you for your book, because I think it opens the possibility that we look at it differently. Because so far, what Zen institutions have been saying, what I've heard all the time I've been in there, is frankly myth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right.
So I guess my question is, don't you think it's just a question of time, and that as Zen institutions grow bigger, we will have scholars who are from the institution and who do not need to follow academia's rule in order to have a career?
Oh, I think so. And I hope so. And I would encourage, especially younger people, to look into this and consider taking maybe what I wrote and going further with it, maybe doing some academic research themselves. Since I'm not a historian and I don't do the original research, I don't have the language skills, I don't have access to the material. But I'm hoping that in the future, more practitioners go that way and take a really good look at it. And they might find some wonderful things in there that none of us have noticed before. It's entirely possible. But yes, I think that's a direction I think we need to go in as we are establishing Zen in the West. We need to have that foundation of an honest history and also a respectable history. And so that we're not just being dismissed as myth, so that we're clear in our own minds what really happened and what the literature has generated as guide us in our practice and to teach us and to illuminate our lives, which is important, but to understand which is which and which is the other. Okay. Thank you for your question.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Barbara, for your visit to Treeleaf Sangha today, the one true Zen school. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Just a joke.
Yes.
I do want to say, as soon as the world opens up again, I hope you will come here to Japan. You've never been to Japan?
No, I'm sorry. I never have.
Well, you come stay at our place.
Okay.
Yeah, you got an invitation. And I want to thank all of you as well for being here today. And it's a marvelous book that will be around for decades. I think it's going to be become the go-to book for how to approach our history, I think, for quite a while. Much needed. So without further ado, thank you all very much. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Good night, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. See you later.
Okay.
Thanks, Barbara.
Bye-bye. I'm trying to close